Hello, everyone. My name is Diana Gugliotta, and I'm delighted to be with you this afternoon for the fourth webinar in the AAA Teen Driver Safety Series. This is a really important time of year to have serious conversations with new drivers. The 100 days between Memorial Day and Labor Day is when we see an increase, unfortunately, in fatal crashes involving teenagers. So we know that new drivers are 3 times more likely than adults to be involved in fatal crashes. So start talking, everybody. Parents, thank you for joining. Family members of new drivers. Hopefully we have some teenagers out there or soon to be drivers out there joining us today. I just wanted to share that when annually we conduct our traffic safety culture index survey, this year we did find that 25% of drivers age 16 to 18 years of age reported driving when they were very tired. And that's what we want to get down and really try to educate all of you who are joining us today about. And we also have Mary Maguire. Mary is AAA Northeast Director of Public and Legislative Affairs, and she's quite the expert on this topic. Today's focus on drowsy driving is a risk that, it's interesting. Mary and I have had many conversations that, many parents talk to their kids about distracted driving and texting and impaired driving. And unfortunately, drowsy driving just doesn't garner the attention that it should. We don't turn on our televisions and see many PSAs that are drowsy driving focused. And this is a conversation that we need to have. So again, thank you. A special shout out to all our educators that are joining. We have many driver education teachers joining us this afternoon, as well as our partners in law enforcement and traffic safety. So to start off, first and foremost, I want to apologize because Dr. Judith Owens had a scheduling conflict this afternoon. But just 2 weeks ago, she actually joined Mary for a conversation on this subject. And we are going to share the presentation that Dr. Owens made with all of you today. And just to start out, just want to kind of go over some research that's important to AAA. In 2018, the AAA Foundation for Traffic Safety released findings on the most in-depth drowsy driving research ever conducted in the United States. Our foundation research used drive cam footage, and don't know how many of you are familiar with drive cam. It's really cool technology. It's a two-way camera that records the behavior of the driver, providing a lot of information, as well as recording what's happening outside, out in front of the vehicle. And for this research, we engaged over 3,500 drivers just in their routine everyday driving. We captured 700 crashes in that footage. So unfortunately, 20% of the study participants were involved in a crash during that research period, many minor collisions. But in regard to drowsy driving, our study found that the percentage of crashes involving drowsiness was nearly 8 times higher than the federal government had estimated. So when the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration estimated, they thought it was about 2% of crashes. So, again, the primary reason that you don't hear a lot of information about drowsy driving, it's one of the most underreported traffic safety issues. And we know that being sleep deprived is very much ingrained in our culture as Americans. To start off, we want to share a news clip with you from the Today Show, documenting the release of this research by our foundation, just to give you an overview on this study.
Here's a question for you as you get ready to head out the door potentially. How much sleep did you get last night? New research from AAA suggests if you miss just 1 hour of sleep, your concentration and reaction time on the road can actually suffer, sometimes with terrible consequences. NBC's Tom Costello is in Maryland with that story. Tom, good morning.
Good morning. We've all done it, zoned out as we're driving down the road. We miss our exit, but this new research from AAA suggests that if we are operating on just 4 to 5 hours of sleep, that can have the same effect as if we're driving under the influence.
Watch these teens drifting off, some catching themselves the moment before impact, others not. But it's not just teenage drivers. A sleep-deprived nation too often asleep at the wheel. This morning, AAA warns too many of us aren't getting enough Z's. Even 7 hours isn't enough, significantly elevating the risk of a crash. Though the CDC says more than a third of us don't even get that much rest. Sleep just 5 to 6 hours a night, and AAA says you're almost twice as likely to crash.
Getting only 4 to 5 hours of sleep in a night is the same as driving while legally drunk. And if you sleep less than 4 hours in a given 24-hour period, you are as impaired as you would be if you are twice the legal limit of alcohol.
It's happened to Carrie Warren.
I did that a lot and thought it was just because I'm a little ADD.
But it was her son, 18-year-old Tyler, who in 2010 veered off this interstate, flipping his car 4 times. Witnesses said he never hit the brakes, so tired at 2:50 in the afternoon, he didn't realize he was in the wrong state, Illinois, not Missouri. A graduating senior, Tyler was hoping to walk on to his college football team.
It's hard because his friends are all starting to buy houses and get married, and he's 18. Like, he's just always going to be 18.
Tyler's parents now on a crusade, warning others of the sleeping danger. AAA says 1 hour less than your normal rest can raise the risk of a crash. Sleep fewer than 4 hours, and your risk increases 10 times.
We've all said it, you know, I don't need sleep. I'll sleep when I'm dead.
I'll sleep when I'm dead.
Unfortunately, it results the other way. You know, you die because you don't sleep.
An important wake-up call with so much riding on it. Experts say most of us need 7 to 9 hours sleep a night. Teens and young adults need sometimes even more than that. But again, 4 to 5 hours and you can be considered impaired. Guys, back to you.
All right, Tom, thank you very much. How much sleep did you get last night?
5.5, 6 hours.
That's about how much?
Normal.
It's happened to me, and it's a frightening thing. So,
hello, Today fans. Thanks for checking out.
So unfortunately, this is a real reality. I want to take a couple of minutes to explain the methodology and some of the data behind the foundation study. So as you can see from this slide, researchers used a technique called the Perclose Measure. So as drivers are recorded, Perclose actually measures the percentage of time within a specific interval that the driver's eyelids are covering their pupil. So Perclose has been shown to be predictive of drowsiness, of lapses in attention, and increased variability in lane position, so tendency for drivers to sort of shift and leave their lane of travel. Research then backs up the recordings. It's recorded at 15 frames per second. So frame by frame, these researchers document the final 3 minutes preceding a crash to examine whether the driver's eyelids were actually closed. So on the next slide, you'll see that young drivers certainly had the majority. Over 54% of the crashes in our study were young drivers. 27% were 16 to 19, 27.4 were 20 to 24. And then when we apply the Perclose measure, almost 10% of the crashes were analyzed. They involved a drowsy driving situation. So results indicated that, when you can observe drowsiness, that's kind of a tongue twister, driver drowsiness, and it says it with Perclose, about 9% of all crashes involve drowsiness, and 10% were very severe, calling police to the scene. So you can read more about this research. Again, it's really the most comprehensive drowsy driving research ever conducted in the United States. And that's all accessible to the public at AAAfoundation.org. And now I'd like to welcome Mary Maguire to your screens. And, it's tough to even watch that clip, Mary, just because knowing what you and your family went through. For the public, Mary has a really unique perspective and experience on this topic to share because as our Director of Public and Legislative Affairs, she's often found lobbying at the Massachusetts State House to improve traffic laws. If you live in Massachusetts or in Rhode Island, you've probably seen her on the news or discussing traffic safety issues. She's a tremendous advocate for us. And she's also an amazing mother of 3 beautiful, intelligent children. She's vigilant about sharing her knowledge with them. I hear her on the phone talking to them, always reminding them to be careful. But as we know, there are moments in our lives that prove that regardless of our vigilance, we're all human. So Mary, thank you for your willingness to share your story.
Of course, Diana. Thank you for that sweet introduction. They're beautiful and intelligent most of the time. They're in their 20s now, so fortunately they're much more experienced drivers, so I worry a lot less than I did when they were just starting to drive. And my 3 children were just starting to drive when I came to AAA in 2008, and that's where the story of Alex, or when the story of Alex, my oldest son, took place. And you know, my story and our family story, Diana, could so very well have been Tyler's story, who we just saw in Tom Costello's report. So I'll start at the beginning. You know, first of all, I have to say, Diana and I are both moms, and there's certainly nothing like being a mom or a guardian or a caretaker or a good friend to really bring these issues home. To really feel these traffic safety issues involving teens in a very personal way. So in 2008, my older son, Alexander, was 17 years old. He was a new driver. He was an inexperienced driver, a good driver, but not a lot of experience. And he was also, like Tyler, a senior in high school. And he was a busy senior. He played on the football team. He had football practice every day. He had a lot going on in terms of school activities. He had a social life, as most high school seniors do. And he was also working very hard on college applications. And so he had that extra layer of responsibility at that point. And as you mentioned in the beginning, Diana, I had just come to AAA. It just started with all of you in traffic safety, my great colleagues. And so, of course, I was drilling Alex about drunk driving, drug driving, distracted driving, and I never thought about the 4th D, which of course is drowsy driving. And it's so important to think about drowsy driving as it relates to teenagers because of the fact that teens are the most sleep deprived segment of the population, precisely because of what I just talked about. You know, they're playing sports, they're doing a million activities, they're seeing friends, and they're often not sleeping that well at night either. So that's another factor that we'll talk about later. But, you know, so many of us are overscheduled. We were very much a go-go family, always on the move. And I think I was so accustomed to being sleep deprived myself, I didn't notice how sleep deprived my son was. So in early October of 2008, Alex was invited to a homecoming dance in Fitchburg, Mass, about an hour and 15 minutes from our home. And of course, you know, very nice girl. He really wanted to go. It was a Saturday night. He had played in a football game that day, end of a long week, lots of practices. And he later told me that when he got in the car to leave for the dance, and that's him with me, dressed up for the dance, about to leave that fateful night, he later told me that he was already tired when he got in the car to drive an hour and 15 minutes to Fitchburg, spend 5 hours at a dance, and then do a long drive home in the dark. And actually, if you look at that photo, he looks tired in the picture. So at any rate, went to the dance, had a great time, was driving home, and he noticed that his eyes were getting heavy and he was very sleepy. And he later told me that before he ended up in this crash, which you see in front of you right now, that he was falling asleep repeatedly. His eyes were closing. And we all know that feeling that Tom Costello mentioned of missing the exit, or sleep creeps up on you. It's very insidious. So what happened was Alex fell asleep on 495 South, just south of the Rentham outlets, for those of you from Massachusetts listening. And he woke up startled, as most of us would be, and noticed that he was taking down the reflectors on the right-hand side of the road. He was off the road. And while a more experienced driver might recover from that better and just ease the wheel back onto the highway, he totally reacted as most inexperienced drivers do, and he cut the wheel really sharply to the left. And that sent his F-150 vintage pickup truck, which was his pride and joy, cartwheeling across the highway. Also flipped 4 times as Tyler's vehicle did in the video. And it slammed against a rock cliff on the left-hand side of the highway and turned completely, flipped upside down, and trapped him so tightly in the wreckage of the pickup truck that he was not able to even move his hand into his pocket to get his cell phone to call for help. You can see the truck is flipped over. His cheek was actually on the pavement. So it was a terrible, terrible crash. And the worst part was that he waited about 2 hours for help. And during that time, his airway was so compressed, he had to really fight to keep breathing. So he focused on his breathing. That kept him calm. But it still haunts me to know that he told me afterwards that his biggest fear was that his truck was going to catch on fire. And he would, of course, would have had no way to escape. So for the grace of God, we thank everyone involved that did not happen. So meanwhile, back at home, I woke up at about 1:30 in the morning with a funny feeling, and Alex was always good about two things. He was good about obeying the junior operator curfew of 12:30 in Massachusetts, and he was very good about picking up his cell phone when I called him. And I went down the hall to make sure he was tucked away in bed and safe. His room was empty. And I knew right away, I just had sort of a mother's intuition that something was not good. I called his cell, went to voicemail, called it again, voicemail, got my husband up, he called, went to voicemail. So we knew at that point that something was wrong. So I was a longtime news reporter, and our training as news reporters when we're trying to track down a crash is to contact all the state police barracks in a given area. And so I started doing that. I started in Fitchburg, went all the way down the line, called every state police barracks. It's about 2 o'clock in the morning at this point, right on down the line to Foxborough, or near our home. There had been no report of a crash. But fortunately, a guardian angel, as I call this person, I still don't know who it is, but I'm eternally grateful to this individual, noticed in the dark, traveling down 495 South, noticed that Alex had been in a crash, and thank goodness called 911. And that really was something that made a life and death difference for Alex. So this person was kind enough to call. I encourage everybody to do that, even in doubt. Call 911 if you see something, say something. And so what happened was that the EMTs then arrived at the scene on the Wrentham North Attleboro line, and they thought for sure, they told us afterwards, that this was going to be a salvage operation, that no one could have survived this crash. But guess what? Alex had his seatbelt on, and I cannot emphasize enough to all of you out there who are students or young drivers or parents or driving school instructors, the seatbelt is the magic tool. It is the tool that works. It is the lifesaver. It cuts your crashes of dying in a crash almost in half, and it is essential for everyone in every spot in the car. Certainly essential for young drivers. So if there's any message that you can send to your young drivers, it is buckle up every trip, every time, and make sure that your young driver, if he or she has a passenger, is not leaving the driveway until that passenger is also buckled up. Nothing like peer pressure. It really works. And again, parents and driving instructors, we all have a great opportunity to model good behavior for our young drivers by always buckling up. So, so that really was the defining measure for Alex in terms of the fact that he was buckled up. What happened was when the EMTs arrived, he heard them. I mean, what an incredible relief that must have been for him to know that help was finally on the way. And again, he was bound so tightly, he was trapped so tightly, he could barely move, but he was able to take his free hand that couldn't reach his phone, and he picked up a piece of jagged metal from the crash, and he started banging it on the metal of the cab. And the EMTs were amazed. They heard it, they heard that sound, and they realized that they had someone alive miraculously inside this truck. It took them 3 sets of the jaws of life to free Alex. What happened was his phone continued to ring as we tried to reach him. Finally, one of the EMTs was able to reach into Alex's pocket and retrieve his phone, and that EMT called me. I'll never forget that phone call. He said, "We are with your son. He is injured but alive." And he said, "Meet us at the trauma center at Rhode Island Hospital," which is where you see Alex right there in the hospital, trying to repair some of the lung damage that he had with that breathing machine. But at any rate, I said to the EMT, "Where are you?" And he said, he gave me the location, and I said, "Well, I'm coming to you." And he said, "Why? Meet us at the trauma center." And I said, "If my son's going to die on the highway," I said, "I want to be with him." And so we bundled up our younger kids. My husband and I both drove very fast, much faster than I would ever normally drive, to the site of the crash. And I have to tell you, as a 25-year veteran news reporter, I've covered a lot of terrible crashes. And to arrive at the scene of your own child's crash and see 5 fire trucks and 4 rescues and 5 police cars is really a stunning thing. I will never forget that image. So the good news is that when I got there, Alex was already on the gurney. He was moving. He was extremely cold. He had been out in the October night, for 2 hours. And I was lucky enough to ride with him to Rhode Island Hospital in the rescue, where they started putting him back together. One of the interesting things that happened is that every doctor we saw in the ER and the trauma center that night had a story about falling asleep at the wheel. One told us that he almost drove off a bridge. So certainly this is something that's very prevalent in shift workers and medical professionals who work long shifts. But the good news again is that he had the seatbelt on, he was alive, broke his shoulder, he had a bruised lung, and most seriously and significantly, he had a paralyzing brachial plexus injury. His nerves had gotten stretched during a long time that he was suspended waiting for help. And that resulted in a paralyzing arm injury. His left arm was paralyzed. But the good news is, again, and this is such a good news story that I love to share because of that seatbelt and because of the fact that my son kept calm and kept his wits about him, and I'm very proud of him for that. The outcome is a happy one because there were several doctors who didn't think he'd ever get the use of his arm back, and he did. We had a wonderful doctor at Boston Children's Hospital who said that Alex would be skiing by the spring, and he was skiing by the spring. After about a month, he started to recover, his arm started to recover, and he did a lot of occupational therapy and worked really hard and had a wonderful occupational therapist who was terrific. But at any rate, I always feel, Diana, that I am one of the lucky ones. We work with so many advocates who do so much wonderful work in traffic safety, who have lost loved ones, children, sisters, brothers, a father, a mother, a grandparent, a friend. These are people who are really doing incredible work and coping with a lot of pain at the same time. So I have always felt that our family is the luckiest family in the world. Alexander is 29 now, and he just got engaged to a wonderful young lady, not the girl from the Fitchburg homecoming dance, but a wonderful woman. So, whenever we have an occasion like that, I think about the difference that seatbelt made for us in our lives. And I just encourage everyone to make sure that they are buckled up all the time, and to make sure that you parents, driving instructors out there are talking with your students and your young drivers about drowsy driving, because as Diana mentioned earlier, it's often overlooked, and it is so important to have these conversations. I really kicked myself after the crash, saying that I should have had a more serious discussion with Alex about drowsy driving, and I made up for that with my other 2 children. So, and it's something that everybody of all ages needs to be cognizant of, because we all have that experience of feeling those heavy eyelids and missing our exit or falling asleep at the wheel. So very important to make sure that you rest.
I remember coming upon a study that discussed the fact that teenagers that often fall asleep at the wheel are the overachievers, like Alex is. He always was that overachiever, great student, very involved in extracurricular activities. Just seeing the pumpkin on the porch behind you in your picture, this is a young man that was really involved in agriculture early on and grew these giant, awesome pumpkins. And he was just, such an active, interesting young man. And thank God, looking at those images is so hard, Mary. And I know those of us that have had the blessing of working with you all these years, I'll never forget coming to work that Monday morning and hearing what had happened. And thankfully, like you said, your outcome was good. Just last week, I got a text message from a friend looking for a recommendation for a vehicle for a new driver. It was a friend of a friend saying, what's the best SUV or pickup truck that I can buy for my, son? And my reaction, immediately thinking of Alex, is whenever possible, try to get them in a car, not a truck or an SUV early on, just because the center of gravity is higher and they are more apt to roll the vehicle. Like Mary mentioned, he rolled over 4 times in that truck. And it's that overcorrection. It's a combination of that and speed that often leads to that. And knowing what we know as traffic safety advocates, we were talking about what a really cool truck that was. And I think you had told me that Alex worked all summer to restore that vintage truck. And he is a very handy young man also. But since then, NHTSA has required strengthened roofs. Okay, so in the last few years, that is one federal motor vehicle safety standard that we've seen. Especially, SUVs are very popular here in the U.S. and trucks. People love their trucks, so that is a change that's had to be made. But you can see how much compression. And if you haven't, anyone watching, seen the video, it's actually a news report that went viral. It's called Room to Live, and it discusses the importance of seatbelt use and how, it is miraculous to see those images and to know that Alex walked away because he had his seatbelt on. But I really encourage you, just put it in, Google it, Room to Live video. And I will say Mary continues to work very, very hard in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to have a primary seatbelt law passed. And
Diana, I think one of the things that's really important to share as part of this program is the fact that I think the inclination of most of us, and I'm talking about people of all ages, we all want to get home to bed when we're really tired. And we're close to that exit. We're 10 minutes from home. We're 5 minutes from home. It doesn't matter. You still have the same crash 5 minutes from home. And so I think the most important message that we can send is that if you are tired, you really need to find a safe place to rest, a safe, secure place to sleep. And we talk about getting that 20 to 30-minute nap, and it really is the only substitute for lack of sleep. We know from the AAA Foundation for Traffic Safety Research, and that was certainly with Alex because his crash happened 15 minutes from our house. So he was at the end of an hour and 15-minute drive, and it was those last 15 minutes that literally almost killed him. So it's so important for all of us to remember that, yes, we so want to get home and get into our comfortable bed and get a good night's sleep, but you can't take a shortcut when it comes to drowsy driving because, again, that insidious feeling of sleep creeping up on you, it just happens, and before you know it, you're out, you're taking down the reflectors on the right-hand side of the road. And again, I think most of us know that feeling. So really important to be patient with yourself and make sure that you find a place to rest.
And that is pretty typical because you kind of naturally relax when you're close to home. You're in your comfortable driving environment, and that adrenaline just kind of leaves the system after a while. So, after Alex's crash, now don't forget, the research that I was speaking about before Mary presented came out 10 years after Alex's crash. So around that time, I know Mary and I became pretty passionate about education internally within AAA and externally about drowsy driving. And we were able to connect with Harvard Medical School's Division of Sleep Medicine. And one of the most shocking statistics Mary and I learned, I'll never forget, we had a meeting with Dr. Russell Santa at the Massachusetts State House one afternoon. He shared that they estimate that 250,000 people fall asleep at the wheel every single day in the United States. Now, we're not talking about completely asleep behind the wheel. We're talking about micro naps. So similar to what was measured in the Perclose Measure, where your eyelids are droopy, covering your pupils, and those little naps kind of sneak in when you're so sleep deprived. And we also have to remember that driving in and of itself is the most dangerous activity in our daily lives. But we became, really vigilant to educate, especially our tow truck drivers. We had some sleep experts come in and talk to them because, really sleep disorders are more common than you would think. And around that time is when Mary also introduced me and our team to Dr. Judith Owens. And Mary, I know you've known Dr. Owens for many, many years. She's now at the team at Harvard, where she's also a professor of neurology, and she directs the Center for Pediatric Sleep Disorders at Boston Children's Hospital. So Mary, I'd love to share your conversation that you had recently with Dr. Owens.
Great.
This is a great group of speakers, and I am going to focus right now on a population that I've been interested in for quite a while now, and that's adolescent drivers, who I think are, all of the risk factors that Brian talked about, I think are really significantly increased in this population, because you're also adding in an inexperienced driver, and some issues perhaps with impulse control. So it's really a perfect storm kind of scenario when we're talking about teens at risk. We can have the next slide, please. So I want to emphasize, and hopefully I don't sound too much like a talking head, but I want to really emphasize this concept of deficient sleep. Because as Brian pointed out, we do know a lot about sleep amounts. How much sleep you get is absolutely critical in terms of causing impairments in attention and vigilance and reaction time and all those things that translate into an increased risk for drowsy driving. But what we don't oftentimes think about is that it's not just not getting enough sleep for your sleep needs, but it's also what's called circadian misalignment, which essentially it's a fancy term for a mismatch between your underlying biological brain-based circadian rhythms and what the environment is demanding. Now, these things are often interrelated, but they both contribute significantly to behavioral and cognitive impairments and poor health outcomes. So bottom line here is, in other words, it's not just how much you sleep, but when you sleep and whether that aligns with your circadian rhythms. That's really critical. And hopefully I'll illustrate that a little bit more as we go along. Next slide, please. So deficient sleep. Next one, previous one, please. Previous slide. Next one. Okay. Well, we skipped one here, but that's all right. There we go. Perfect. So what does this mean? What is this concept of deficient sleep? How does it play out in the real world? Well, it affects cognitive function, particularly what we call executive functions. And that's decision making, problem solving, planning, organization. And you can imagine how much that plays into your ability to safely be the driver, be behind the wheel. It affects attention, it affects memory, learning of new tasks, emotional regulation, and particularly risk-taking behaviors. So individuals who experience deficient sleep take more risks because they perceive less in the way of negative consequences for taking those risks. And that is so critical, because the decision to get behind the wheel when you haven't slept enough and you're tired and you're exhausted can be further compromised by being tired and exhausted. So next slide, please. So Brian presented some elegant statistics about drowsy driving, but we know that it's the young drivers who seem to be involved in at least 50%. And I totally agree with Brian that drowsy driving accidents are way underreported, and there's no breathalyzer test for drowsy driving, right? And unfortunately, because the driver does not attempt to avoid the accident, because they're asleep, the issue of fatality is very real. So we simply don't have accurate statistics about that. Nonetheless, we did a survey of high school drivers in Fairfax County, Virginia, which is one of the largest school districts in the country, 183,000 students. And at that time, their school start time was 7:20. Almost 50% reported drowsy driving, and the prevalence was significantly higher in those students who are getting less than 7 hours. So we're talking about a cut point here that is significantly higher in terms of risk versus higher risk versus less risk than it is in adults regarding sleep duration. And there's also some evidence to suggest that there may be an increased risk in minority populations. Brian spoke eloquently about the association of impairments related to sleep loss and compared to those with alcohol intoxication. And what I say to parents is there is no way you would allow your adolescent to get behind the wheel having knowingly consumed 3 or 4 beers. You would not give them those keys. But yet the level of impairment that we see in these students, these high school drivers, is equivalent to that. Not only that, but data from the CDC has suggested that there are other risk behaviors which can further exacerbate the risk for drowsy driving and crashes. Use of seatbelts. Mary, described how her son's life was saved by having a seatbelt, but students who are getting less sleep are less likely to use seatbelts. They're less likely to use bicycle helmets. They're more likely to be distracted drivers, and they're more likely to take the risk of drinking and driving. So that adds to the risks associated with drowsy driving and magnifies them significantly. Could I have the next slide, please? And this illustrates the time of day of teen crashes. And as you might imagine, there's a peak in the morning when students are driving themselves to school, and there's a peak in the afternoon when they're coming back from school. Interestingly enough, you would kind of anticipate that the crashes might be worse in the evening hours, and that doesn't necessarily seem to be true. And you can see in the second graph here, the difference between time of day crashes in the summer versus the school year. Personally, I would be really interested to see whether the pandemic, had an effect on drowsy driving crashes in teens because they weren't driving at those critical risk periods. So there's a research project for you. Next slide, please. So just to put my 2 cents in about a related issue that I'm very passionate about, and I was the lead author of the American Academy of Pediatrics recommendations in 2014 about healthy school start times. And the recommendation was to delay school start times until 8:30 or later for all middle and high school students. Next slide, please. Now, what do we know about what happens when you do delay school start times? Well, there was a study that's now over 10 years old in Kentucky, in which one district changed their school start time from 7:30 to 8:40, and the percent of teens involved in car crashes went down by 16% in that district compared with an increase of 9% in the rest of the state. There was a study in Virginia, 2 studies in Virginia, that looked at adolescent crash rates in 2 very similar counties in Virginia, one of which started at 7:20 high school start time and the other at 8:40, and found a 40% higher crash risk in the earlier starting high school. A study published by the CDC in 2014 showed a reduction in crash rates in 16 to 18-year-olds by as much as 65 to 70% in certain states. Now, as a public health person, I can't think of another measure that would have that big a bang for the buck. And we recently published just this year a study in Fairfax County, Virginia, that compared crash rates in Fairfax County in the 2 years before a school start time change from 7:20 to 8:10 and the 2 years after the change, and found a significant decrease in crash rates in Fairfax County compared to an increase in the rest of the state, which amounted to approximately 126 fewer crashes in Fairfax County, Virginia. Next slide. And just to leave you with, another tragic story, it's not just the driver that can be affected. This was a terrible story of a high school senior who killed the superintendent of her school, driving to school at 6 a.m. She was talking on her cell phone, and she also left the scene of the accident. 2 very bad decisions, right? And, I emphasized at the beginning that sleep deprivation, deficient sleep affects decision making. And this was a really tragic situation that is going to have long-term repercussions on the whole community. So things to keep in mind when you're thinking about letting your teenager get behind the wheel when they haven't slept enough. Thank you.
Dr. Owens gives us so much to think about. And, for Mary and I having the benefit of working with her for 10 years or more, I think we've both learned a great deal from her. One thing in particular that I just want to note, because it's actually the focus of our Teen Safety Series webinar next week, is the connection between sleep disorders in children and ADHD. And that's for adults too. But as we're talking about teens, I remember mentioning to her that my son, from the time he was an infant, struggled, did not have a good sleep routine or a regular sleep pattern that seemed to be working for him or normal for a child of his age. And around that, he was probably in 4th grade at that time that I had this conversation with Dr. Owens, and she said, by any chance, are you also starting to see any signs of ADHD? And I would say back then, I didn't see hyperactivity or as much impulsivity. I started to see that later in his teen years, but with focus, absolutely. Academically, he was doing very well in school, but the sleep disorder, sleep challenges, and the focus issues really did go hand in hand. And she's probably one of the foremost experts in our country on that connection between sleep disorders in children and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So again, next week, we are going to delve into that topic a bit more and talk about how ADHD also can lead to higher risks with teens in terms of traffic citations and crashes. So of all the things that we've learned from Dr. Owens, this slide probably is a good synopsis and highlights a lot of the things that I really want every young driver and parent to pay attention to. Really the need for 9 hours of sleep every night. I remember Dr. Owens saying to me, the average American teenager is getting about 5.5 hours, but yet they need as much sleep as they did in their early elementary school years for brain development. So that's so important. And I know, Mary, this is a challenge for every parent, just the cell phones and bringing cell phones into the bed, physically into bed with them, laptops into their bedrooms. A lot of young people actually use their cell phone as an alarm clock. So it's kind of there by the bedside, but between the artificial light and the impulse to kind of pick it up and continue to check in with friends and message and use social media late at night, it definitely is not a benefit to their sleep patterns.
Yeah, I think you raised so many great points, Diana, and you're absolutely right. And that's where parents, and again, guardians, caretakers, friends can play a role when it comes to setting limits, around teen driving. So that means, you stash your cell phone in the basement, you don't sleep with it, or, you talked about the fact that so many teens have sleep problems, and we know that there are a lot of teens who are taking drugs like Adderall during the day to help them focus in class, but those kinds of drugs that keep you very alert during the day can also interfere with your sleep at night. So I think that's going to be a really interesting session next week for sure. One of the things with Alex that we were most relieved about is that his date from the homecoming dance was not in the car. And as scary and awful as it was for him to be by himself, we were so grateful that no one else was injured in that crash. And that's another area where parents can really set limits, because we know that in addition to all of these other issues, that multiple teens in a car is an even more potent distraction than the smartphone. The smartphone is second to multiple teens in the car, according to our AAA Traffic Safety Foundation research. So again, we have, of course, the passenger restriction for new drivers in Massachusetts anyway and elsewhere. But again, in the beginning, I said to my kids, you can drive your one friend when you're able to do so, but one. I don't want to see, and I still shudder when I see 6 young drivers packing into a car together, because it's a recipe for disaster. So I think we, again, as parents and caretakers and leaders, can really try to not only model good behavior, but set some real limits. And you know what? Our young drivers want limits because they want to feel safe too. So I think we've got a real opportunity to make a difference and save lives. And again, don't forget about that seatbelt. The seatbelt is a life changer in so many cases.
It needs to be included in a parent-teen driving contract. Those contracts are so, so important. And, another topic that comes up, going along with this is, so many parents just saying, I don't understand why my kids want to stay up so late, but then I can't get them out of bed in the morning. And we see that in the summer in particular. But, Dr. Owens does explain that there is a shift that comes with puberty, not necessarily with chronological age, that makes it difficult for them to fall asleep before 11 p.m., but they still have that need for 9 hours, or maybe sometimes even a little bit more than 9 hours. So I guess for the parents, there's a reason that they're not falling asleep early, but you can't get them out of bed. That's normal. They're absolutely wired for this. But if you are noticing some irregular sleep habits, absolutely, that's something to mention to their pediatrician. That's something that could be addressed. They could get a referral to a sleep lab, and that's very important to do. Also, set those curfews. Talk to teens about a plan B in getting home if they're too tired to drive. I wish we could have some t-shirts made that say naps save lives, napping is good. And that's actually one of the questions that we received before this webinar was, what's that magic number? If you are exhausted when you're driving, how long of a nap should you try to fit in? And it was interesting because former NHTSA director, Mark Rosekind, did do some on that topic. He worked with NASA, he worked with airline pilots, and it showed that just taking a 26-minute nap improved performance by 34% and alertness by 54% compared with those who didn't take that nap. So I'd say add an extra 4 minutes, go for a solid half-hour nap. That's a great idea. Just, stop and rest if you need to. And just some other great resources I think we should mention. The National Sleep Foundation has a robust website. It's sleepfoundation.org. There's a lot of great tools there as well. Harvard School of Sleep Medicine, I mentioned earlier that Mary and I found great partnership with that organization. They have a wonderful website with some great videos that you could share with your teenagers too. It's healthysleep.med.harvard.edu. I know that's a long one, so I'm going to repeat it one more time. It's healthysleep.med.harvard.edu. And also just keep in mind, many teenagers these days are taking daily prescription medications. We want to know, even over the counter or prescription drugs, what can cause you to feel a little bit more sleepy behind the wheel. And so the AAA Foundation developed a great resource called Roadwise Rx. It's free, it's confidential. You just go to that website, punch in any over-the-counter prescription medications or over-the-counter, any herbal supplements as well that can affect your safety behind the wheel. You just type it in and it generates a report for you. And Mary, I know you've gotten this question. I've gotten this question as well regarding apps and technology that can help. And so I just wanted to mention, I think Mercedes was the first auto manufacturer to come out with some technology around drowsy driving, but Audi and Volvo as well. They have drowsiness detection systems built into vehicles that can monitor the vehicle's movements, like steering wheel angle and lane departure. These are sensors set up with audible alerts that can, it tries to bring the driver back. There's also some vibration in the seat or on the wheel. You'll often see a coffee cup icon illuminate on the dash to tell you, okay, time to take a break. But the systems are getting more sophisticated over time. Some of them are so sophisticated that they can monitor changes in heart rate. And the algorithms are just incredible. They can detect changes in your breathing that are typical to someone who's sleeping. So they'll send you more and more alerts. But again, regardless of how good the technology is in a vehicle, this need for sleep is biological. It's going to take over at some point. So the best solution is not to drive when you're drowsy or pull over and take a nap. So,
Diana, it's so true. We often say at AAA, the only substitute for lack of sleep is sleep. And, I think another important point to make is that, I often, in talking with young drivers, hear them say, oh, I've got coffee, I've got Red Bull, I've got the windows rolled down, I'm blaring the radio, I'm listening to my music really loudly, and I'm singing. We even talked to one of the medical students who worked with Dr. Chuck Seisler, who's one of the nation's and the world's foremost experts on sleep, who Diana and I have done some work with at Harvard. One of his medical students told us a story that she was so tired driving home from her hospital shift at night that she would open her sunroof and put her ponytail out through the sunroof, and it was so painful, she said it would keep her awake. So as funny as that story is, it's also dangerous. And all of these things that many of us assume are good substitutes for sleep are not good substitutes for sleep. Again, the only substitute is sleep when you are sleep deprived, and you really have to pay attention to the signs that your body is giving you and take that 26 or 30-minute nap that Diana just talked about, and find a safe place to do that. And the other thing is, as I mentioned earlier in the conversation, Diana, I wish that I had known that Alex was tired when he embarked on his trip. And I would have said, go upstairs and take a nap for a half hour. You can be a little late. This is more important. So I think that's another good conversation for all of us as parents and caretakers to have with our young drivers. Make sure that before they leave for the day or the evening or go on a trip, that they've gotten the proper amount of rest, because an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
Absolutely. And our last few weeks of summer are upon us. So those of you planning road trips, leading up to Labor Day, one thing I love about our website, which is the Triptych website, you can plan out your road trips the same way you would have normally. And we still do this. You can still walk into a AAA branch office and plan out a road trip, but it accounts for safe places to stop. And, we encourage everyone, don't do those cannonball run road trips. Don't try to drive straight through without stopping to sleep. Schedule a break in, we always say, every 100 miles or 2 hours. And our website can help you do that and find the good, and interesting places to stop, fun places too, and safe places, most importantly. So plan on that. And on our next slide, I know there's these are our last little, tips. So pay attention to these symptoms of sleepiness. But like Mary said, you don't always know when that's going to hit. If you're sleep deprived, the biological need for sleep just kind of takes over. But, just the inability to keep your head up. When you have passed a kind of a mile marker or an exit and you're not sure if you did or you didn't, that's probably a good time to say, I've had enough. Okay. And sorry, on this last slide, we have our website, AAA.com/community. And that's where you go to find one of us. Mary and I work within an outstanding team of traffic safety educators, and we love to talk about drowsy driving. Again, because not enough people are talking about the problem of drowsy driving. So if you'd like a presentation for students or within your community, please just visit our website. You can email or contact any of us, so we can do that for you. All our programs are free of charge and open to the public. So thank you for joining. And Mary, thank you again for sharing a very personal story with us today. And
a story with a happy ending, and I'm so grateful for that. And we want to see more happy endings at AAA by people paying attention to issues like drowsy driving and wearing seatbelts and not driving distracted. There are a lot of potential negative stories out there that can be transformed into happy endings and happy stories if we put safety first.
And congratulations to Alex on his engagement.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Congratulations to your son who's headed off to college.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, everybody. Well, that does it for us. It's 5 o'clock somewhere in 5 minutes. So we've kept you a little bit over today, but it is such an important topic. So again, AAA.com/community. You can find us there. Thanks and have a great night.
Bye-bye, everybody. Thanks, Diana.